Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So as Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. A government shutdown, Tim, is right around the corner. March 1st for certain government departments, and then March 8th for some of the bigger agencies like Defense and Homeland Security, Commerce, State Department. I wonder if the American people are so used to these threats of government shutdowns. It reminds me of the politicians who cried wolf. There seems to be a certain amount of boredom about it.
Well, if you think about it, in all of the various budget brinksmanship that we've had over the past really couple of decades, I would argue there hasn't been any political consequences for these various government shutdowns, right? I mean, has one member of Congress even sweated re-election because they engaged in budget brinksmanship? Probably not. And certainly no one has lost a seat because of it. So I think until there's some kind of political consequence from it, members are going to feel emboldened to do this. And certainly in a divided government, when you have the House of Representatives separated by 2 or 3 votes, any one member of Congress could be that person holding things up for whatever their agenda is. But I think if you take a step back and look at the whole thing and trying the border to it, yes, of course, we need to have a border bill yesterday. But to think that this Congress that's so divided could attempt to address an issue that has stumped members of Congress literally for decades in a matter of a few weeks, and also in an election year, I will put it charitably and say that was rather ambitious to think that they could accomplish this. There are obviously hurt feelings from the House basically refusing to take up the bill. I don't see any way that the House would be, even forced to hold a vote on that bill. The bottom line is a lot of our friends in Washington just aren't dealing with the reality in front of them, and certainly the art of the possible of what they can get done. So we'll see in the next few weeks what they can do. But I don't know about you, but I'm not real hopeful that they're going to get something that's a good bill through.
Oh, and I'm pretty sure nothing will happen. But meantime, the issue is that this border crisis is a huge problem for the Biden administration. So many polls show that voters are increasingly blaming him on the border crisis. And so now Trump and Biden are heading over to the border this week to try to make some political hay over this.
Well, it's going to be great theater to watch, of course. It has become increasingly an albatross for Biden. The polls show that his disapproval rating on the border is something like 70%. So at the very least, he needs images of him and the aviators looking tough at the border. Maybe they'll sign an executive order of some sort dealing with immigration. The issue, though, is certainly the Republicans in the House gave Biden a gift to be able to say, I would have signed this bill. Here are the things that I'm for. So rhetorically, that's a great gift to add to his kind of inoculating himself from his poor performance on the issue. I guess the main takeaway, though, is whatever executive order is signed and whatever nothing gets through Congress, people are still looking at the experience in their communities. If you live in Philadelphia or Chicago or LA or New York and you're seeing this, or in the border communities, you're seeing what's going on in your town, and you're seeing the president sign some executive order or, some minor thing passes Congress, and it's probably not going to make much of a difference. So I guess the question will be, Biden may get a good photo op, but will it really help him politically in the long run, when we see the result of it will certainly be minor at best.
Actually, Tim, I wouldn't mind. Remember those automatic spending cuts that got triggered a while back? I think it's called the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Remember when it got triggered a few years ago? Well, it was amazing that I think was it one government employee who was laid off? It's true the Defense Department took a pretty big hit in terms of readiness, but it's interesting that the departments would rather cut programs and spending than bureaucrats.
Well, and apparently that's one of the issues that may be thwarting a congressional deal on spending because the maligned deal that Kevin McCarthy negotiated on the budget last year does have an automatic 1% cut in it that kicks in sometime later this spring if Congress hasn't reached a deal on spending by a certain date. And you're starting to see some of the Freedom Caucus members all of a sudden are liking what Kevin McCarthy negotiated and are thinking, well, if you look at the alternatives we have, that might not be a bad alternative. So that 1% cut hanging out there, may be actually making it harder for Congress to reach a budget deal anytime soon.
Well, the other bit of intrigue is that the GOP chairwoman, Ronna McDaniel, has finally stepped down. Tim, I've lived in Washington for many years, and in Washington, the RNC is where politicals go when they don't actually get hired at any of the public affairs offices and the agencies. I don't know why they don't hire former successful politicians or powerful fundraisers for that job.
Well, when you look at Ronna McDaniel, right, she's been in there a long time, almost 8 years. And the job of the RNC chairman is two things. It's to help Republicans win, and it's to raise a lot of money. And she really hasn't succeeded on either of those scores. So it kind of makes you wonder, in years past, right, when the president suffered a big political defeat, usually at the top of the list was firing the party chairman. So it kind of makes you wonder, how has she lasted all this long? Aren't there other talented Republicans who could be the national chairman? And it also has me thinking, well, someone who is the best fundraiser in Republican history and also one of the most brilliant strategists in Republican history is sitting around with not a lot to do. And of course, I'm referring to the former speaker. I know they have kind of a route that they want to go for the national chairman, but if I were Republicans, I'd be giving the former speaker a call to run the Republican Party.
Absolutely. I thought of him myself. Yeah, he would have been the perfect candidate, in my opinion. So our podcast this week is Steve Hilton, who was a keynote speaker at our recent Sacramento conference, Tim. So Steve was a top advisor to David Cameron when he was prime minister in the UK. And he also hosted that Fox show, The Next Revolution. And now he's running Golden Together, which is focusing on new ideas to increase affordable housing in California.
That's a very interesting presentation that he gives. I think it's very encouraging. If you're a conservative who's discouraged about the potential for, policy victories on free market ideas and free market objectives, I think you should listen to Steve because he will give you some encouragement for what is actually possible despite the long odds in our state.
Thanks so much for listening. And here's Steve Hilton.
I do feel at home every time I come to a wonderful event with PRI. As you said, PRI is in the family. I'm so proud to be here to support you and all your incredible work. It's a fantastic organization. Thank you all for being here to support PRI. Just before, I just want to say one thing. I know I was just rushing out a little bit earlier, and I can see there's a look of slight anxiety on the face of a couple of people that I rushed out of the lobby of the hotel just a few minutes before this event began. And I can see, well, hang on a second, aren't you our speaker? Why are you rushing out of the building? And so to any of you who had that thought, I was just going to get my cup of tea from Starbucks. And so I just have to say, look, I now stand before you as a proud American as of 3.5 years ago, just about. But, old habits die hard, so you got to have your cup of tea. And by the way, do you see the latest news on tea? The Houthis, if I can make that terrible joke, are now intercepting tea supplies. So there's now a tea crisis looming in England because the tea supplies through the Red Sea being interrupted. That's the least of the problems, of course, in that region. But it just struck me this morning when I heard that on the news. And again, if only Leo were here to accept our appreciation of his role in cleaning up the city. And of course, the other great character that has helped clean up another great city here in California, San Francisco, Xi Jinping. Thank you, Xi Jinping. Because, of course, it was for him that they managed to clean up San Francisco a few weeks ago. Isn't it just embarrassing that is what we've come to, that they can do it for movie stars and communist dictators, but not for the people who actually pay the taxes for these people to do their jobs. Outrageous. So Sally mentioned that the state capital is undergoing renovation. That's an interesting word. I think I'd like to replace renovation with a more aggressive word, shall we say, in terms of what we need here in California. It seems to me we don't need renovation. We need revolution. That's what we need in California. I don't know if any of you caught my show, The Next Revolution. Anyone watch The Next Revolution? How about we make the next revolution the California Revolution? That's what we need. That's what I want to talk about today, and I want to give you a sense of what might actually be possible. I know this is not a political event. I'm not going to get too into politics, but in the end, policies are enacted through the political system. And so in the end, we do have to look at that as we want to advance the revolution that we want to see, along the lines that Sally outlined, free market policies that free people to be who they want to be. And that, of course, is the essence of California. I mean, even before we moved here as a family back in 2012, so nearly 12 years we've been here, I remember back in the day working, as Sally mentioned, for Prime Minister David Cameron, leading our domestic policy reforms there in 10 Downing Street. The media in the UK used to mock me. I mean, that's nothing unusual there. But the media used to mock me for the way I was inspired by the idea of what California would be, even before I'd ever come to California. The idea of California was such an inspiring and positive idea. And we all know what we mean by that. California as the beacon of innovation and energy and dynamism and optimism, everything good in the world. There's this amazing phrase that I came across as now I've got more involved myself in the fight to save California. That's, by the way, one of the reasons. I know people ask me a lot of the time, why did you stop doing your show? We just had that conversation just here at the table. And actually, the direct answer to that is I love this state. I love the state that we've made our home, and I want to fight to save California. I'm getting involved in that fight. Thank you very much, and you'll hear more about that in the months and years to come. And in that fight, you can't actually. There's a rule that means that as a host of a show, you're not allowed to speak at political events and so on. So I wanted to free myself from that constraint. I'm still with Fox, as you heard, but I'm all in for saving California. Thank you. And as I was engaging in that, getting deeper and deeper into both the policy issues, but also reading about California's great history, there's this phrase that I came across in a book that's so beautiful. And to me, it captures everything we should all be fighting for. Here's the phrase. California means to America what America means to the world. And I just thought that's such a special phrase. It's so right. But of course, it's gone so wrong. Both parts of that actually have gone so wrong. If we think about America's standing in the world today and where it should be, we know what's gone wrong there. But of course, California doesn't mean that anymore. We know what it should be when it says California means to America what America means to the world. A beacon of hope and inspiration and energy and optimism and dynamism and all those things that I just spoke about. But we're not that anymore. I mean, even in the 10 plus years I've been here, it's changed so badly. And you go back to Europe, as we often do, and when we first moved here, people would say, you used to tell them where you live, and they say, oh, California, it's amazing. And everyone would have some kind of reaction or reference point, but it would always be positive. If you told them you live in Silicon Valley and it were young people saying, oh, amazing technology, Google, whatever, they may mention the weather or the beautiful scenery or Yosemite or Disneyland. Always something positive when you mentioned that you live in California. And now it's the exact opposite. And they literally look, and I'm sure you've had the same experiences. Oh my, are you safe? Is it okay? Is it as bad as they say? How terrible that that's what's happened to our beautiful, incredible state. We mustn't allow that to become the future of California. Yes, it's been the recent past, but we can affect the future. We need that California revolution. And when we look at what needs to change, I mean, I'll be happy to take some questions when I've finished, and you may have specific areas that you want me to dive into. And I'm very happy to be amongst policy people because I don't often get the chance to get really into the details of policy. But the thing is that when you ask the question, what needs to change in California? What is the California revolution? The short answer is everything. Everything. There's not a single thing that's going right. I mean, here's a simple way that I find of capturing it, and it's not an exaggeration. If you look at the league tables on different issues within America, right now, California is pretty much on every issue. We are bottom of every list that you want to be the top of, and top of every list you want to be the bottom of. And that's not near the top or near the bottom. It is literally the case that we have the highest taxes of any state and the worst poverty at the same time, which is pretty much a genius accomplishment if you think about it. In education, we have the highest spending per student of any state and the lowest literacy. The lowest, not just 46th out of 50 or 50th out of 50 on literacy. We spend the most and get the worst outcomes. You look at housing that Sally mentioned, something I'm working on, as she said, very directly now. We have the highest housing costs in America and the lowest home ownership. The lowest home ownership. What happened to the California dream? That idea that you come here and you make your way in the world and you follow your dreams and you own a home and build a business and build your future and raise your family. That's all gone for people. The idea of owning your own home is gone for most people in California. That is a crime against the future and our generation that just cannot get on the housing ladder. You look at everything else. You look at the one I couldn't believe the other day, business climate, right? It's actually, it's worse than the worst. We're not just the 50th out of 50 in terms of business climate. We're actually worse than that because we're worse even than Puerto Rico. So, I mean, I could go on. I don't want to depress you, but that's the point. Everything needs to change. We do really need a revolution. And so the question is, how do we get there? And here I want to just lay out a couple of the theories that I've heard from other people as I've been engaging more and more in this. And I want to show you why they're wrong, but how we can get to where we need to go. So people sometimes say, look, forget about it. You're never going to win a majority for the kind of reforms that are needed. What you can do is win ballot initiatives. So that's a way that we can get the kind of changes that we need. And yes, that is true. If you look at ballot initiatives over the last few years, it is true that many have gone in a, you could say, conservative direction on all sorts of issues, on crime and on racial preferences and on the regulation of gig workers, etc. That's true. But what happens after the ballot initiative where the right side of the argument wins? Those people over there, am I pointing the right way? Yeah. They say, well, these people, by the way, who never stop lecturing us about saving our democracy. Yeah. These people see the people vote down an initiative or vote for an initiative for positive change. Oh, we don't like that. We're going to reverse it in the legislature. And that's what they always do. So, there's no permanent victory through a ballot initiative. They're doing that right now, aren't they? On racial preferences. They didn't like the outcome of the ballot initiative, so now they're trying to introduce legislation to undermine it. And you see that on every single issue. So while it's, of course, true that we should try and make progress on these ballot initiatives, and very encouraging to see the progress on the one right now to overturn Prop 47. That looks like that's going to qualify, and that's fantastic. But who believes that they're going to just leave it at that? So that is always just a partial response, the ballot initiatives. The second thing you hear a lot, particularly I have to say from the business community, particularly in this town, is, well, you're not going to get Republicans who really believe in positive change, free markets, and so on. So we need to support moderate Democrats, pro-business Democrats. And so you've seen a lot of money, frankly, move from supporting Republican candidates to supporting moderate Democrats. And especially when you combine that with the top two system in California, it has led to a situation where what do you have now in the legislature? You have 62 Democrats in the Assembly, 18 Republicans. In the Senate, 32 Democrats, 8 Republicans, a supermajority. And so where has it got us, this idea that the answer is to support moderate Democrats? It's led to the most far-left policies anywhere in America with the results that we just see. So that doesn't work either. So here's my argument to you today. There's only one way to bring about that California revolution to save the state we love, and that is to elect people at every level who really do believe in the kinds of changes that we need to see. That's the only answer. And when people say, forget about it, that'll never happen, it's always going to be this deep blue state. I'll give you a couple of facts and a couple of grounds for optimism, if I may. Number one, when people tell you there's no chance because it's such a deep blue state, well, I had a look at the numbers. And if you look at statewide elections, since the last time a Democrat didn't win, the last time a Republican won a statewide election in the state, 2006. If you average out the Republican vote in all statewide elections since then, in all the statewide offices, the vote is 41.8%, which is a lot higher than some people think. It's not. I'm not saying it's great, but it's not nearly as far behind as some people think. And then you look at when you dive into the details of how people think politically in this state, you look at the fact that actually on those ballot initiatives, the conservative view prevailed. That tells you something about where people are at. You look at polling data right now where the pollsters ask, is California going in the right direction or the wrong direction? There's a majority who say wrong direction. There's a majority who think we need to change direction. A majority. You look at individual policy issues on crime and education and taxes. The conservative position is more popular. You look at the demographics of our state. The largest group in California now, Latinos, 40%. Here's the breakdown: 40% Latino, 35% white, 15% Asian, 5% black, 5% Native Americans and others. So 40%, largest group, Latinos. You see what's happening across the country. Running away from the Democratic Party. In Florida, in Texas. Not yet here, enough. But there's some potential there. So when you add all that together, and you look at what's happening, and I see this every day now, working at Golden together on the policy ideas that we're advancing to try and bring about that California revolution. When you talk to people, they're absolutely fed up with what's going on. They know we need change. They know we need change. The ingredients are there. I'm very, very confident we can do it. But we have to be focused and professional and united and clear about how we're going to get there. But I think if we do all that, and that's what I'm working on now, that is my focus. I hear all the time people say, oh, why are you bothering with California? Just move. I said, why? Why should we move? Why should we move? Because they've gone off to the far left. No, they're the ones that we need to move out of office. That's what needs to happen. We're staying. I'm staying. I'm fighting for that California revolution to make this state, this beautiful state that I know we will love so very much, golden, truly golden, together. Thank you very much. So I promise not to go on and on so that we can have time for some questions.
Questions, yes. So,
which is always my favorite part. So really want to hear from you. Thank you.
Steve, the first question from the audience is on the Attorney General's office politicizing the ballot initiative process. As you know, the Attorney General's office has a role in writing the titles and summaries of different ballot measures, and the past several attorneys general, all of whom happen to be Democrats, have been very political in the way that they write those titles and summaries.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I mean, funnily enough, we've just been through that process. And if anyone asks me about housing, I can tell you what we're working on. Can I just come out of the room there and show you my very exciting T-shirt, if I may? There you are. There. So probably a little hard to see at the back there. I have a T-shirt with words on it, Cal Homes Now. And if you go to calhomesnow.com, you can see the initiative that I'm working on, which is to, I shouldn't have said right now, right? Because you've got to listen to what I'm saying. But after the event, Cal Homes Now, it's an initiative to reform CEQA, as Sally mentioned, to eliminate the private right of action under CEQA, which for those of you who followed that issue is the number one reason that we have these endless, ridiculous lawsuits that block pretty much anything from being built. So it's a very radical change, actually. That's our initiative. And when we anticipated from the Attorney General exactly what you're describing there, which is a really unfavorable title and summary, to our surprise, actually, it was pretty neutral on this occasion. So the title and summary we've been given for our ballot initiative, for which we're out collecting signatures now, it's called the California Home Ownership Affordability Act. On our one, we actually didn't get a bad result. But you're completely right. I mean, the most egregious example was Prop 47, wasn't it? Prop 47, which legalized theft up to $950 a day, now in the process of, we hope, being overturned. I think that was literally described as the Safer Neighborhoods and Schools Act or something sort of outrageous. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Orwellian. So I completely agree. We do need, it's ridiculous that power to define these initiatives is in the hands of a partisan elected official. And we have a perfect alternative, which is the Legislative Analyst's Office, which actually is genuinely independent. I mean, the Legislative Analyst's Office, it really does do good work of putting out reports. For example, they recently, to Sally mentioned the deficit, the $68 billion deficit, and and Gavin Newsom in his budget said, oh, no, it's not 68 billion, it's only 30 billion or whatever, as if that's good. But still, and the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, absolutely aggressively pushed back on that. And said, no, he's wrong, the governor's wrong. So we have an existing trusted institution that is genuinely independent, that could and should write those ballot initiatives. I absolutely agree with that as a common sense reform.
Hello.
Steve, the second question is about a very timely question with the primary election just around the corner. The top two primary election and what can be done to either repeal or reform the top two primary.
It's incredibly frustrating to me because if you look at those numbers in the legislature that I spoke about, 62 to 18 in the Assembly, 32 to 8 in the Senate, I think the top two system is largely responsible for that because that's been the dynamic that you've seen. Going back to my earlier point about business, which is when you get that, and you combine it with the districting that's gone on, and then you do end up with a situation where it looks as if you're going to have, you've got two Democrats, one's backed by the unions, and the other one isn't, and then you've got a Republican that's further behind, and then you can see why the argument develops for business organizations who actually agree with the policy positions of the Republican, but they look at the top two and they say, wow, the Republican's not going to even get in the top two, so why waste my money? I should support the least bad Democrat. That's been the dynamic. But the consequence of that is not only that you end up with these races where you end up with a Democrat, but guaranteed to win, and this massive lopsided situation in the legislature. And by the way, just remember what the data that I just gave you about statewide. So if you just take statewide voting as a proxy for public opinion across California, okay, then the number is in the elections over the last 10 years or so, 41.8% for Republicans. Let's just call it 40, right? 60-40. Let's just use that, and that's a very stable number if you look at statewide elections. So roughly 40% of voters in California vote Republican. And yet in the legislature, that balance is like 80-20. So this top two system has caused a real distortion. And it's the opposite of what it was promised. They promised that this would lead to moderate outcomes. Because if you have a top two, then the candidates appeal to the more of a center ground. The exact opposite has happened. We've gone off to the far left. It's actually kind of turbocharged extremism. So I do agree with you. How we get there, I mean, you're right. It was created through an initiative, so it's a constitutional one. So I guess we need another initiative to overturn it. But I do agree with you.
Steve, the third question is about career politicians who, even though they've served a lot of time in the state legislature or in Congress, are going back to the local level and running for board of supervisors or city council, seemingly to enrich themselves. We're thinking politicians like the disgraced Kevin De Leon in Los Angeles, or now former supervisor Sheila Kuehl in Los Angeles County.
They never leave. I totally agree. And you can't winkle. And also, by the way, with the queues, and then the other one is there's Janice Hahn, right? And in LA, I was just talking to Alex Villanueva, who's running for LA for the Board of Supervisors in LA County. By the way, that's an amazing thing. LA County. No one pays attention to this race. 10 million people. It's the biggest in the country. The budget is like $70 billion, and it's 5 people. 5 people running it. So there's a massive problem of I just think the lack of accountability over all levels of government in California. We're the 5th largest economy in the world, and all this money is spent by these people who are often anonymous, and no one even. Janice Hahn, that family seems to me, from what I learned from Alex Villanueva, basically inherited the position. Like we don't, it's like some kind of hereditary monarchy system in California. And it's just crazy, and they've been for year after year after year. I couldn't agree more. So one thing may be to cut the pay. How about that? Yeah. Cut the pay. I mean, this is the thing, by the way, slight digression, but you hear all the time, and this is an argument familiar to me from the UK as well, which is, well, if you're in public service, not just the politicians, but also government, public sector workers and so on, well, the reason that you have to give them these incredibly generous pensions, totally unimaginable for regular people, and of course here in California, it's not just the pensions, it's also the healthcare, luxury healthcare. It's OPEB, isn't it? Other post-employment benefits in the budget for the policy nerds following along. So huge cost, way in excess of anything available in any other state, including neighboring democratic states. So the argument used to be, well, they're making such a sacrifice to give their lives to public service, that we need to give them generous pensions and generous vacation and all this stuff. But then you look at what they're earning now. I mean, these are just astronomical salaries. I just was looking at, we live in the Bay Area, it's some local council that, not even a senior position, it was like $340,000 or something. And you just look at that across the state at all these levels of government. So I think, and so no wonder they don't want to leave. You can't ever get them out. And then they get the support of the political machine and the unions, and then it's totally, the corruption is there, isn't it? As we all know very well, they give generous pensions and healthcare and deals to the unions, and then they get not just the donations, but also the organizing muscle, the door knocking and all the rest of it is totally corrupt. So I think just working on every aspect of that, cutting what they're paid, is absolutely vital. It's a great question, because so many of these things, we can talk about the policy that we need to see, but in the end, you've got, and actually just like your question about top 2, actually, in a way, if you could call these structural defects of our system are so important to address, because they underlie why we have all these terrible policies.
Steve, the 4th question is an important one for growing the conservative movement in California, and that's how do we increase ethnic and gender and age diversity in the conservative movement? It's critically important to grow our ranks.
Yeah, it's a really important question. It goes to the heart of how we achieve that California revolution, and I think that my answer to it, I'll give a general answer, then we can look at some of the details. I think that as we go out there and we try and, but remember that, going back to the numbers, again, stressing this is, not a political event, but you've got, okay, how do you get that extra 10%? How do we get to the point where there's a majority for the kinds of policies that we support here? And we can start to implement it at the state level and eventually in the legislature. And the answer is you need to persuade people, right? By definition, you have to persuade people who are currently either not voting or voting for someone else to vote for you. That's the math. If you get from 40 to 50, if it's 60-40 right now, you've got to get from 40 to 50, an extra 10%. How do you do that? And I think that there's a very important lesson for how all of us make our arguments, which is you've got to, just as in life, if you're trying to persuade someone, you're nice to them, and you try and be, you win them over, and you try and find points of connection. You don't yell at them. And so I think it's very important that as we go forward in this effort, there's 2 words that sound very simplistic, actually, when I will say them. You'll think, oh, that's very obvious. But I find myself saying them over and over again. And in fact, I used to, for those of you who watch the show regularly, I used to have a segment on my show titled with these following words: positive and practical. positive and practical. And it sounds so silly, of course, that things should be positive and practical. But actually, a lot of the time in political conversation, we don't hit those 2 points. And you're constantly criticizing the other side and yelling at them and screaming. And, there's a lot to criticize, of course, in California. But that doesn't necessarily win people over. And so you've got to be positive. Here's what we're going to do. And then you've got to be practical. Do it in not ideological, not theoretical, like specific things. Because most people aren't interested in politics. They don't follow it. They don't care. They just want to know what's going to happen. Positive and practical. So I think that is, and so that's why, for example, in all the work that we're doing, and I'll give you now a specific example, that's why actually the first issue that I wanted to focus on in Golden Together was housing and home ownership, actually, which is, I think, a more positive way of putting it, which is, it's because it's an issue that actually isn't particularly ideological or partisan. It's exactly the kind of issue to win people over. Because who's most fed up with the current housing crisis, the situation on the housing? It is younger people who can't get on the housing ladder. And they're literally saying, I can't even raise a family in California anymore because it's so astronomically expensive. I'm never going to be able to afford a home. So they're leaving in their droves. This is what, housing costs are the number one reason people are leaving our state. So we joke about it, and you saw Gavin Newsom and DeSantis in that debate, DeSantis going on about people leaving and U-Hauls, and we see all that rhetoric. But actually underneath that, the number one reason people are leaving are housing costs. Housing costs affect everyone. It's not just the people who can't get on the housing ladder. It's not just about owning, it's about renting. Rents are so astronomical. Why? Because we just don't have enough housing built. There's not enough homes that were built. We used to build like crazy in California. You go back to the 50s and the 60s, that was what it was all about, just expansion. And so I could talk all afternoon about housing. I'm not going to do that, but I'm just using it as an example of something that brings people in. Who cares about that issue? Younger people, Latinos, right? The California dream. You want to raise a family. You don't want to be told you're going to have to live in some apartment building. This is California, not North Korea. You want a home with a garden, enjoy the weather with your kids, right? That's the California dream. And so that's a really specific, positive, practical point of connection. We want you to be able to own your own home. And here's how we're going to do it. So I think that in a way, it takes the politics out of it. It's just very pragmatic, common sense things, not ideological, just a way of bringing people in so we get a majority for the kind of change we want to see.
And the last question, Steve, is about something near and dear to your heart, and that's about the lack of infrastructure in California being hindered by CEQA and other state and local bureaucracy, adding time and expense to critical infrastructure projects. And then also things like homeowner association dues that make it so expensive to own a home and add to our housing unaffordability problems.
You see, you're going to force me, aren't you, to talk about housing? No, you're quite right. It's such a big issue. Let me try and do it quickly. So again, completely correct. And that's one of the... so let's just take it in order. Infrastructure, completely correct. That's why our initiative, the California Home Ownership Affordability Act, it's got two components and it addresses the things you raised. The first component is to eliminate the private right of action under CEQA. I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to convey to you who maybe haven't studied it closely what that means and why it's so important. CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, passed in 1970, signed by Governor Reagan. It was meant for big polluting factories and things that we'd all agree should be protected. It didn't cover housing. And over the years, the courts, not the politicians, not the legislature, anyone elected, the courts have extended it in two ways. First, they extended it to cover absolutely everything that moves, that you need to get built. And secondly, they granted this private right of action. So anyone can bring a lawsuit to block anything, basically. And so if you look now at CEQA lawsuits, 70% of them are used to block housing. 70% of all CEQA lawsuits. And then you look at the scale of what that's impacting. Right now, there's here's the number that will just stagger you when you hear it. This is the number of housing units across the state of California that are currently blocked by CEQA lawsuits. The stock, not in 1 year, just the stock of where we've got to. It's over 1 million. Over 1 million housing units blocked by CEQA lawsuits. Just in 1 year, in 2020, I think was the last year we had the data, maybe 2021. That year, we built just over 100,000 housing units in California. 48,000 were blocked by CEQA lawsuits. That's just in 1 year. So it's a massive issue. And And remember that these things, these housing units, they've already been approved. They've been approved by local communities. They've gone through zoning. They're actually already compliant with CEQA. So these are totally bogus lawsuits. And guess who brings them? Most of these lawsuits are filed by our friends, the unions. The unions file the lawsuits. They make up some fake name like Concerned Environmentalists of Sacramento or whatever it may be, and they use these lawsuits to extract leverage. So they demand, higher wages. They call it prevailing wage. They demand union workers be employed for everything. They call it skilled and trained. And so this is what's going on. And actually, the more that you dig into everything in California, you realize who really runs California are the unions. And that's not just the public sector unions in terms of teachers and schools, but actually even in the private sector as well. It reminds me of, now big digression. Sorry, I'm going on and on. I moved here from the UK, and this reminds me of the 1970s Britain before Margaret Thatcher's union reforms. It's absolutely staggering to me how we've allowed such union dominance of everything that moves in California. So that's what's going on. So our initiative eliminates that private right of action. And to your question directly, it's not just for housing, but for infrastructure to support housing. So because it's not just the house. They often use these lawsuits to block the water and the energy and so on as a proxy. They don't want to look as if they're directly blocking housing, because that's a bad look. So they block the infrastructure and on bogus environmental grounds. So our initiative addresses that directly. It removes the private right of action under CEQA for housing and the infrastructure to support housing. Now, that's not going to solve the whole problem, but it's a really big part of it. The second point you make, and the second part of our initiative, again, when I dug into this, I just couldn't believe the scale of this. All the different fees that are levied now for building housing and for in this whole area, just staggering. If you add up all the fees, a typical housing unit in California now will have levied on it $100,000, $150,000, sometimes $200,000 of fees when you add it all up. On that, just paid by the developer, by the house builder. In San Francisco, they were charging, if you add it all up, $300,000 per apartment. Not for the apartment building, for each apartment. So of course, they're going to sell for some astronomical price, and regular people can't afford housing. So the second part of our initiative caps fees at a proportion of the construction cost. So there's so much going wrong with the way housing operates. Our initiative addresses two of the most egregious things, and would make a big difference. So I'm going to be yanked off right now. So I have to go and do a radio interview myself. So that's, thank you, Sally. I just want to leave it. So now I'm going to say to you, please go to Cal Homes Now. Cal Homes, CALHOMES now. Cal Homes Now. And sign up to get your petition. We're trying to get this on the ballot. We're trying to get a movement going so that we can actually build things in California once again and make this state golden as we all want it to be. Thank you very much, everyone.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.